February 5, 1945, northern Italy. The wind screamed through the Apennine Mountains, slicing through olive groves and shattered stone villages. Snow and mud blended into a cruel landscape where every step could draw fire. Through the white haze, dark shapes moved uphill, the men of the U.S. 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers. Corporal Henry Hank Williams adjusted his M1 Garand and glanced up the ridge. His platoon had been ordered to take a German machine gun nest overlooking the Serchio Valley. The enemy had the high ground and the advantage. "Keep low," his lieutenant whispered, crawling forward through the fog. The sound of boots crunching snow mixed with the distant hum of artillery. For months, rumors had haunted the 92nd. Other divisions called them unfit for combat. Even some of their own commanders doubted them. The War Department had hesitated to deploy them at all, insisting black soldiers could only serve in support roles. But now, here they were in the cold heart of Hitler's last line of defense, the Gothic Line. High above them, hidden among the rocks, German MG-42s opened fire. Bullets ripped through the snow, kicking up deadly geysers of white. "Down! Down!" someone shouted. Williams dubbed behind a frozen wall, his helmet ringing from a near miss. The smell of cordite and churned earth filled the air. Private First Class Elijah Moore, barely 20 years old, from Georgia, pressed himself flat against the ground, whispering, "Lord, don't let me die in this mountain." But retreat wasn't an option. Behind them, the valley was filled with Allied wounded, and ahead, the Germans were dug in like wolves. Lieutenant Charles Jackson, a veteran of the 370th Infantry Regiment, wiped snow from his face and shouted above the gunfire, "We move on my signal. We didn't come this far to die crawling." Williams nodded. He could barely feel his fingers. The Buffalo Soldiers had marched miles through ice, slept in barns, fought prejudice from their own side, and still kept moving. The lieutenant counted down. 3, 2, 1. They surged forward. Grenades flew, detonating against the stone bunker. The mountain erupted in smoke and fury. Williams leapt into the trench, firing point blank as German troops scrambled in shock. Within minutes, the position was theirs. The machine gun lay silent, its barrel smoking. Lieutenant Jackson stood, chest heaving, and raised his rifle skyward. "That's what the Buffalo Soldiers can do," he shouted. For a brief moment, surrounded by ruin and snow, the men of the 92nd felt the weight of history shift, not because someone allowed them to fight, but because they refused to stop. As they dug in, word came down the line, this was just the beginning. The Germans were massing north of Massa, and Hitler's last defensive wall in Italy, the Gothic Line, was waiting. The world still doubted them. But the Buffalo Soldiers were about to prove that courage, not color, decided a man's worth. February 9, 1945, the outskirts of Massa, Italy. The mountains loomed like giants, their jagged peaks veiled in fog and smoke. The Buffalo Soldiers trudged forward through terrain that chewed up tanks and broke men's spirits. Every hill seemed alive with fire. Every valley hid the muzzle flash of a German gun. The Gothic Line, Hitler's last wall of defense in Italy, stretched from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic. Reinforced bunkers, minefields, and steel obstacles covered every inch of the ridgeline. Even the veteran British and American divisions had stalled against it. But now, the 92nd Infantry Division had orders to break through. In the command tent, Colonel Edward M. Almond traced his finger along a worn map. "The Krauts are dug in here, here, and here," he said, tapping points along the ridge. "We'll hit them from the south with the 370th Regiment. Take the high ground, and the valley falls with it." Lieutenant Jackson studied the terrain, brow furrowed. "Sir, that ridge is mined. We'll be climbing straight into MG fire." Amund's reply was cold, "Then climb faster, Lieutenant." Outside, snow turned to sleet. The men huddled under tattered ponchos, checking weapons slick with moisture. Williams pulled out a small photograph of his wife back home in Alabama, whispered a silent prayer, and tucked it beneath his jacket. When the order came, they moved quiet, deliberate, every step measured. The mountain seemed to swallow sound, until a single German flare streaked upward, lighting the world in pale fire. Then hell erupted. Machine guns screamed from hidden bunkers. Mortars exploded along the slopes. Trees splintered, men fell, and the air filled with the echo of shouting in English and German. "Get to cover!" Sergeant Thomas Baker roared, dragging a wounded soldier behind a rock. "They've got us zeroed in." But the 92nd didn't break. They advanced in bursts, crawling, firing, climbing one ridge, then another. At one point, Williams spotted a German nest pinning down the platoon ahead. He pulled the pin from a grenade, whispered, "For the boys," and sprinted through open ground, hurling it into the bunker. The explosion tore through the hillside. When the smoke cleared, the nest was gone. By dusk, the ridge was theirs. Bodies lay frozen in the snow, American and German alike, but the Buffalo soldiers stood. From the valley below, Allied spotters blinked in disbelief. The 92nd had done what seasoned divisions couldn't. They had cracked the southern wall of Hitler's fortress. That night, fires burned low in the captured trenches. Williams sat beside Lieutenant Jackson, hands trembling as he loaded a new clip. "You ever think they'll believe it?" Williams asked quietly. Jackson shook his head. "They don't have to. History will." The wind howled through the mountains, carrying with it the faint sound of distant church bells. The men of the 92nd huddled together, cold, hungry, exhausted but undefeated. They didn't yet know that in a few weeks, they would push through to the very gates of the Po Valley, shattering the myth of the invincible Wehrmacht. And when the story was told, the men once mocked as unfit to fight would stand among legends. March 3, 1945, near Saravetsa, Tuscany. The snow had melted into thick, sucking mud. The smell of pine and gunpowder clung to the air. The Buffalo soldiers were pushing north through the battered hills when the order came down from division headquarters: hold the line at all costs. German counterattacks were hammering the Allied front. The 92nd Infantry, stretched thin and undersupplied, now faced a desperate enemy fighting for every inch of Italian soil. The 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division had moved in to stop them, elite troops hardened by years of war. At dawn, the mountains trembled. Mortars whistled overhead, slamming into the forward trenches. Earth erupted, raining shards of frozen mud and shrapnel. Men ducked instinctively, clutching helmets as the first wave of German infantry advanced through the mist. "Here they come!" Sergeant Baker shouted. "Steady your fire." Williams crouched low, peering through the smoke. He could see dark figures moving across the slope, silhouettes against the rising sun. His finger tightened on the trigger. "Wait for it," Jackson ordered. "Wait." Then, at 50 yards, fire. The M1 Garand barked in unison. The hillside flashed alive. German soldiers fell, others dug behind rocks. The Buffalo soldiers held their ground, bullets slicing the air like hornets. Private Moore reloaded, his hands shaking. "They just keep coming," he yelled. Jackson slammed a fresh clip into his rifle. "Then we keep shooting." By mid-morning, the first wave had shattered against the 92nd's defense, but the second came harder. Machine guns roared from higher ground. An 88mm shell landed near the command post, killing 2 medics instantly. The concussion threw Williams backward, his ears ringing. When he looked up, he saw the German line surging forward no more than 30 yards away. He crawled toward a fallen bazooka, its operator slumped nearby. Grabbing it, Williams steadied his aim. The world narrowed to a single moment, one chance. He squeezed the trigger. The rocket screamed across the valley, slamming into a German half-track. It exploded in a bloom of fire and steel. The enemy advance faltered, panic rippling through their ranks. Beautiful shot, Hank. Baker shouted. You just bought us another hour. Reinforcements arrived by afternoon. Another company of the 370th Regiment moving up under covering fire. Together, they countercharged, bayonets glinting, boots pounding through mud and smoke. By nightfall, the ridge was theirs again. The ground was scorched, the trees shattered, but the 92nd still stood. In the aftermath, Lieutenant Jackson limped through the trenches, checking the wounded. When he reached Williams, he simply nodded. No speeches, no cheers, just the silent understanding of men who had stared down death and refused to break. That night, the radio crackled with reports, enemy retreating north. Buffalo Division holds position. For the men of the 92nd, it wasn't just another victory. It was vindication. They had been told they couldn't fight. That they didn't belong on the front lines. But in the mud of Saravetsa, under fire from Hitler's best, they had fought and they had won. As darkness fell, Private Moore whispered from his foxhole, "You think they'll remember us?" Jackson looked toward the horizon where the distant lights of the Po Valley flickered like stars. "They'd better," he said softly. "We just made history." April 4, 1945, Mount Nebion, northern Italy. The morning broke cold and silver, the mist rolling over the valley like a living thing. Below, the remnants of the German 148th Infantry Division clung to the last bastions of the Gothic line, a web of bunkers, concrete pillboxes, and hidden artillery built into the mountainside. For months, they had defied Allied advances. Now, the 92nd Infantry Division was ordered to end it. Lieutenant Charles Jackson stood over a map spread on the hood of a jeep, tracing the contour lines with a gloved finger. "We take Nebion, the road to the Po Valley opens. The Krauts lose everything north of here." He looked up at his men, mud-streaked faces, worn helmets, eyes hollow from months of fighting. "This is it. No one expects us to make it. That's exactly why we will." The climb began before dawn. The men moved single file along narrow goat trails slick with dew, each burdened with a rifle, rations, and the heavy silence of fear. Above them, the mountain shuddered with artillery bursts. Williams trudged forward, boots slipping on shale. Every step felt like a lifetime. Behind him, Private Moore whispered, "Can't believe this is Hitler's last line. Feels like we're climbing into hell." Williams managed a grin. "Then we're gonna knock on the devil's door." At 0700 hours, the lead platoon reached the ridge and the mountain erupted. Machine gun fire tore through the mist, bullets snapping overhead. Mortars thundered, showering the slope in smoke and fire. "Cover! Find cover!" Jackson shouted, diving behind a rock outcrop. Pinned down, the Buffalo soldiers returned fire with precision born of desperation. Williams spotted muzzle flashes from a bunker above and called out coordinates to the mortar team. 205, High Ridge. Fire for effect. The reply came in seconds, the boom of American 81mm mortars echoing across the valley. The bunker disintegrated in a burst of dust and flame. The line began to move. Inch by inch, yard by yard. Men crawled, stumbled, advanced through wire and smoke. The Germans counterattacked fiercely, their machine guns cutting through the fog like saw blades. But the 92nd refused to yield. Sergeant Baker, bleeding from a shrapnel wound, rallied his squad forward. "Get up that hill. They said we couldn't fight, let's show 'em how wrong they were." By midday, the Buffalo soldiers breached the final ridge. Jackson's men stormed the upper bunkers, hurling grenades, clearing rooms with bayonets and rifles. When the last shot echoed across the valley, a strange stillness followed. It was over. The Gothic line, the mountain fortress built to hold back the Allies, had fallen to the men who weren't supposed to be there. As the smoke drifted away, Williams stood at the summit, looking down at the valley below. The sun pierced the clouds, lighting the fields of Tuscany like a painting. For the first time in months, he let himself breathe. Below, German prisoners were being marched down the mountain, men who, hours ago, had laughed at the idea of black soldiers defeating them. Now, they walked in silence, heads bowed. Lieutenant Jackson joined Williams at the ridge. "You did good, son," he said quietly. Williams nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "We all did." That evening, as the division gathered in the captured valley, a single radio broadcast cut through the static. "Allied forces have broken the Gothic line. The 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, led the assault." Around the campfires, weary men smiled through tears. No medals had been promised. No headlines awaited them back home. But they had fought, and in doing so, they had rewritten what courage looked like. April 26, 1945, the Po Valley, Italy. The road north was littered with the remains of a dying empire. Burned trucks, shattered helmets, and abandoned weapons marked the retreat of Hitler's once mighty army. The 92nd Infantry Division advanced through it all, exhausted, mud-covered, but victorious. The radio crackled again that morning: "German resistance in northern Italy is collapsing. Allied units advancing toward Genoa and Milan." For the Buffalo Soldiers, it was the news they had bled for. Corporal Henry Hank Williams walked beside Lieutenant Jackson as they entered a small village near La Spezia. The townspeople, gaunt and barefoot, lined the streets cheering, waving scraps of cloth like flags. An old woman pressed a handful of flowers into Williams's hands and whispered, "Grazie, soldato." He smiled, unsure if he deserved her gratitude. The war had taken so much friends, innocence, faith, but in that moment, he understood what it meant to fight for something bigger than himself. That afternoon, as the 370th Infantry Regiment pushed into the open valley, they met no resistance. White flags hung from farmhouses. Columns of surrendering German soldiers trudged down the road, their rifles slung uselessly over their shoulders. Sergeant Baker limped beside them, his uniform torn, bandaged arm tucked against his chest. "Look at 'em," he muttered. "All that talk about a 1,000-year Reich, ended by a bunch of men they said couldn't fight." Jackson glanced toward the horizon. "History's funny like that." At sunset, the 92nd halted on a hillside overlooking the plains of the Po. Below them, the last light glinted off the rivers winding through liberated Italy. For the first time in years, there was no gunfire, only the sound of the wind moving through the wheat. The men gathered quietly. Some prayed. Others sang softly old spirituals that carried through the dusk, their voices trembling but proud. Williams pulled from his pocket the worn photo of his wife, its edges frayed from months in the field. He looked at it for a long time before tucking it back into his chest pocket, close to his heart. "Think they'll tell this story?" Moore asked, staring at the fading sky. Jackson smiled faintly. "Maybe not right away. But the mountains remember. And someday, so will the world." The war in Italy would end days later. Germany would surrender within the month. But for the men of the 92nd, the Buffalo Soldiers who had stormed Hitler's final fortress, the battle for recognition would continue long after the guns fell silent. When they returned home, there would be no parades waiting, no banners bearing their names. Yet among those who had seen them fight, Allied and Axis alike, the truth could not be denied. They had faced prejudice, betrayal, and an enemy who believed them lesser. And they had won. In the official records, it was written simply: "The 92nd Infantry Division advanced north of the Serchio Valley, breaching the Gothic line and entering the Po Valley." But in the memories of the men who were there in the mountains that still bear their scars, it meant something far greater. It meant that courage has no color. And on those cold Italian peaks, where the Buffalo Soldiers carved their place in history, the echo of their footsteps still whispers through the wind, a quiet reminder that valor is not granted. It is earned.